when we talk about the Tocqueville's great concern that America is going to go down the path towards centralization, the Common Core in its particulars provides a great study in how this happens. It shows how the people become disengaged from civic leadership, and it shows a step-by-step disengagement of the people. And this is similar to what Dr. Evers and Professor Deneen were talking about with local education institutions. I mean, what happens in particular to parents and the education of their children. So they institute a step, take away a little bit of authority of the parents and disengage them a little bit, then they can come back and say, well, parents aren't engaged as much anymore. We need to grab a little bit more power and authority, and so it goes. So I want to go through those particulars, and some of them, the discussion has already begun. Bill talked about how the Common Core came about and how the National Governors Association and Council of Chief State School Officers got involved, and how they had tremendous private funding. Joy Pullman here has done some great work in discovering that those two entities are also getting money from the federal government in various grants and contracts. So you have this entity that is purporting to lead a state movement, when in reality their funding on this is coming from private entities, and then they're also engaged with the federal government, and then of course they're taking kind of dues monies from the states. But it's important to note that as Bill said, these are private entities, they're privately incorporated, and they're not a state body. They don't have grants of authority from the states. They're not subject to Freedom of Information Acts or other sunshine laws. What's more, they're headquartered in the District of Columbia, not even in a state. So it would be difficult for the states to even assert legal jurisdiction over them in most cases. So then you look at the particulars of, follow the money. What are some of these grants? They got a tremendous amount of grants, millions and millions of dollars in grants before 2009, that is before the Common Core had been written or even the process had begun to write it. Some of those grants included things like to partner with federal, state, public, and private interests to develop common, open, longitudinal data systems for $3 million, to help governors improve college and career-ready rates and make state education systems internationally competitive, $2.4 million, to work with state policymakers on the implementation of the Common Core standards. These are some of the grants that they've gotten over the years from 2007 through the present. But the central point here is that this undercuts the design of the constitutional system, really, of federalism. One of the linchpins of federalism, one of its main purposes, is that government should be responsive to the people. So what's happening here? Governors and school chiefs, instead of being responsive to the people, they're looking to this association for policy and direction. And as I'll point out at the end of my presentation, I think it's become quite clear what the consequences of it are to these politicians. So clearly the Common Core is not state-led. Now we heard, among other places, a testimony here in Indiana. Some groups were saying, well, this Common Core was a good idea, and the problem is that the federal government hijacked them. Well, that's not true. The federal government did not hijack them. So, and why is that not true? Well, in December 2008, while the new administration was preparing to take office, the National Governors Association and Council of Chief State School Officers issued a report called Benchmarking for Success. And in this report, they called for a new vision for the historic state-federal partnership in education, one in which the federal government could assist states in specific ways at each stage of the journey, including by incentivizing the states to, as soon as possible, offer new funding to help upgrade state standards by adopting a common core of internationally benchmarked standards in math and language arts for grades K to 12, and to help ensure that assessments are aligned to the standards, and to help ensure that textbooks, curricula, and assessments are aligned with the standards. Then the report also offered, suggested that the federal government should then, once those programs got underway, the federal government should then offer a range of tiered incentives to make the next stage of the journey easier, including increased flexibility in the use of federal funds and increased flexibility in meeting requirements of existing federal education laws. So instead of state-led, we had these private entities with no accountability to the states, to the people, asking the federal government to intercede in the business of the states. This wasn't hijacked. This was a request of the Department of Education and the new administration to take on this project. So what's happening, though, if you look at de Tocqueville's concern about centralization, is what's happening. The governors and school chiefs have changed their direction of what they're paying attention to. They've changed it from discussion and discourse with the people, trying to give the people a full briefing of what's going on and elicit their thoughts and opinions, to really looking at this privately driven agenda that's sponsored by this private association. So then what happened next? Well, the stimulus bill was being drafted, and Congress put in the stimulus bill $4.35 billion to the Department of kind of a discretionary appropriation of money to the U.S. Department of Education. And right away, when the Secretary of Education was asked, what are you going to do with this money? He said, well, I really like the work that Achieve and Gates are doing on common national standards, and I want to be the catalyst that makes this happen. And so here we have this step-by-step process, and as Sean Filer and the subsequent speakers noted, right away you had politicians on both sides of the aisle endorsing this and talking about how great it was going to be, and how these standards would be evidence-based and internationally benchmarked and rigorous and all of that. But the problem was the standards hadn't even been drafted at that point. So politicians are painting themselves into the corner, right? And then there was an element of coercion in the grants, political coercion. And because, remember, it's the crisis, the fiscal and economic crisis, and this stimulus program was going to be the life jacket, or the savior of the states, and they had to get as much money as possible for it. But the Race to the Top program had a couple of unique features. So states had to compete for the money. They had to compete for their taxpayers' money. And the way they had to compete for it was, as Bill was talking about, this is all geared toward a monopoly. They had to compete for it by showing and demonstrating their allegiance to the president's NGA, CCSSO education agenda. So they initially applied for the grants in 2 phases, phase 1 and 2. Now, in the grant applications, the states also had to show that they had joined a second consortium. They had to join 2 consortia. One was a consortia of states that were supposedly drafting these standards. And the only consortia out there was the NGA CCSSO consortia, and the entity drafting those standards was its contractor, Achieve, not the states. And subsequent panels will get into that process. They also had to join a second consortia, and that consortia was an assessment consortia. And then in the race to the top applications, they had to attach the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, by which they joined the second consortia. So then you get to the applications, the grant applications themselves. So in the grant applications, the states had to commit to the Common Core. It was the only common program out there of preparing to draft standardized national assessments. They also had to submit their a memorandum of agreement by which they joined the assessment consortium. Now, in those memoranda of agreement, the states committed themselves to using the Common Core. So by the time the states submitted their application, they had already signed on to the Common Core and the assessments that were to be aligned with the Common Core, even though neither of those products had been produced. The other dynamic going on was the politicians that signed the states on and supported this were further painting themselves into the corner. Of course, to sign on, they had to tell the people, this is great, this is fabulous. And the more they did that, certainly the less likely they were going to be to correct themselves when the product was released. So the timeline is also telling and kind of shows how the states were subject to political coercion. The states had to submit phase 1 applications by January 19th, 2010. National Governors Association issued the first draft of the standards in March 2010. So again, when you submit the application, you commit to the Common Core. First draft of the standards was issued in March 2010. States had to submit phase 2 applications by June 1, 2010. NGA issued the final Common Core standards on June 2nd, 2010, the next day. And then the phase 2 applications had 90 days, to August 2nd, 2010 to fulfill their commitment by formally adopting the Common Core, which in most cases meant that their state boards of education had to sit down and in that short period of time, look at the standards, look at the previous standards, compare the two, look at the evidence on which the Common Core was based, evaluate that evidence. What else should they do? Oh, probably notify the state legislature, because this was a radical transformation of education for every child in America. And I'm not sure what else maybe they should do, perhaps a cost analysis. And are we leaving anything out? Oh, yes. Tell the American people or tell the people of their state what they're doing. So now, but this isn't just a past issue. It's an issue going forward. So you have this structure. The Common Core are owned by the National Governors Association and Council of Chief State School Officers. The idea is to have standards that are common across all the states. You know, you have to implement the standards 100%. You can add 15%. You're not supposed to change any of the standards. It's a tremendous governance question going forward. The states have given up a tremendous amount of autonomy in participating in this system, the assessments and the testing. So this deals with things like cost. You know, you're beholden to the assessment systems in terms of how much the tests are going to cost. You're beholden to them in terms of how much technology infrastructure you have to buy and maintain, because both of these testing consortia, the idea is that they're going to be, the tests will be taken on the computers. You're beholden to these systems in terms of how many days of testing you're going to inflict on your students and teachers. And you're beholden on them in terms of what the cut scores are that determine what's proficient. You're really beholden upon them in terms of curriculum, because whatever's tested is going to be on the test. And it goes on and on and on. It's a tremendous amount of state autonomy, state sovereignty that has been abdicated. And it's tremendously increasing the distance between the child and the decision makers in the child's education. So then we get to the present time now. Many governors are starting to realize what's happened. And I'll reference, and school chiefs too. So South Carolina's Governor Nikki Haley, in a letter supporting Common Core exit legislation, argued, just as we should not relinquish control of education to the federal government, neither should we cede it to the consensus of other states. And you might add, nor should we cede it to associations or private corporations or anything else. The principle of federalism mandate that state legislators and governors protect and guard their sovereignty. It's not a time to walk away from the guard duty and go to the tavern. Georgia Superintendent of Education John Barge last month issued a statement explaining why his state had pulled out of the testing consortia. And the reasons he expressed are really a defense of federalism. And this is something that all the governors and superintendents and state legislators need to understand and focus on. This isn't a past deal. It's a very much a present issue. And we need strong leadership from these authorities to reclaim their control over education. So this is what Superintendent Barge said. He said, we're going to form our own tests. We're not going to have an outside entity create those tests and maintain those tests and be in charge of those tests. Why? Because we have to decide, we have to be responsible for the amount of time students spend on testing. We have to be responsible for the costs. We have to maintain the ability to make adjustments or changes to our standards as we see fit. And in so doing, he pointed out that if Georgia shifted or revised certain standards, then the resulting misalignment with the PARCC test would put its students at a disadvantage. And this is so whether it's the PARCC test or SBAC, either the consortia, or whether it's a test that's controlled by any outside entity. And that's the principle of federalism. You have to safeguard and protect this authority of individuals to direct their government. And that was, I think you mentioned, Bill, Governor Hunt and Governor Romer talking about, well, we can't have the federal government involved, but what we got to do is get private entities involved. No, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of those governors, not you, Bill, of course, but a fundamental misunderstanding of federalism. Federalism is meant to protect citizen-directed government. The idea that the citizen, the individual, is the ultimate earthly sovereign. So, but we have, the good news is continuing along these lines. Indiana's Governor Mike Pence signed Common Core pause and review legislation and pulled his state out of the out of the testing consortia, and in so doing, he repeatedly sounded the theme of federalism, declaring that he would stand guard and protect it. And so now what's happening, now we're hearing from governors who actually implemented the Common Core and who painted themselves into the corner and who were likely told, obviously one would hope, that it was a mischaracterization by their superintendents about the Common Core being of high quality. Now they're finding out and realizing they really don't like it, but they've painted themselves into the corner because, and it gets back to de Tocqueville, this is how the centralization happens, the people are disengaged from their leadership. This Common Core is a great case study in this. It's also, I'll end this on this, Melanie Curtis asked the question, are we too far down that road? And I think Professor Bradley answered it in some of his comments. This movement, this parent-led movement, I think is the spark that is going to reclaim our sovereignty and our dignity as citizens.